I still remember that moment vividly. I was rushing through the concourse of Louis Armstrong Airport, one hand pulling my suitcase, the other pressing my phone tightly to my ear. The wall clock read 5:30 p.m., and my 6 o'clock flight was about to close check-in. A multi-million-dollar negotiation was waiting for me on the other side of the country. And then, right by the curb leading into the security checkpoint, I saw her. A young woman, her skin glowing a warm brown like New Orleans honey, was sitting curled up on the cold concrete. In her arms was a baby. They had no suitcase, no handbag, no backpack. Just a thin jacket hastily wrapped around the child against the chilly autumn wind. Her eyes, heartbreakingly beautiful, yet utterly exhausted, met mine for just a second, then quickly turned away, as if she no longer dared to expect anything from this world. I should have kept walking. I had a schedule, contracts, responsibilities, an entire business resting on my shoulders. But something about that image, a mother clutching her child in desperation, slowed my steps, then brought me to a complete stop. And then I did something that, even now, whenever I think back on it, I still cannot believe I actually did. I reached into my bag and pulled out the keys to the house by Lake Pontchartrain, the house my father had built with his own hands years ago. A place filled with childhood memories, with humid summers scented by lake water and the sound of family laughter. "I'm flying out for negotiations for 3 months," I said, my voice hurried but firm. "You can stay there for now. The house is empty." I didn't know her name. I didn't know where she came from. I didn't know what had driven her and that child to sit huddled in an airport like that, but I knew one thing. In that moment, she needed someone to trust her. And I, for reasons beyond logic or calculation, did. 3 months turned into 6. The negotiations were far more intense than I had expected. Clauses dragged on. New demands kept surfacing. I was held away from home longer than planned, and when I finally returned, when I drove back toward Lake Pontchartrain, my heart heavy with anxiety, I braced myself for the worst, afraid the house would be destroyed, afraid I had been taken advantage of, afraid I had been hopelessly naive, but I was completely unprepared for what awaited me. I pushed open the gate. The front garden was overflowing with carnations and Louisiana lilies. The air carried the warm, unexpected scent of freshly baked cornbread. And right by the lake, in the old wooden rocking chair my father had built by hand years ago, an elderly woman was holding a child, smiling gently as she pointed out the ducks swimming nearby. The woman turned around, kind eyes, a warm, steady smile, and I felt my world shatter. Because it was my mother, the woman whom, for 6 months, the entire New Orleans police force, private investigators, and hundreds of missing person flyers had failed to find. My mother, the woman I believed I had lost forever after our final, furious argument. But my mother looked at me as if I were a complete stranger, and she said softly, "I'm sorry, miss. Do we know each other?" My name is Maribel Dubois. I am 55 years old. I was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, the city of jazz, spicy Creole cuisine, and half-real, half-mythical stories told on front porches on summer evenings. I am an African-American woman, 1.68 meters tall, with the warm brown skin characteristic of Creole heritage. My hair, once long and full, is now cut neatly and worn straight in a serious, professional style. My eyes are dark brown, and people often say my gaze is as cold as that of a CEO accustomed to making layoffs. But once, my eyes knew how to smile. I run Dubois Heritage Imports, a company that imports high-end handcrafted goods from Africa and the Caribbean. It was my father's life's work, Langston Dubois, built from nothing with his own 2 hands. My father died when I was 25. Pancreatic cancer. Before he passed, he held my hand and said, "Daughter, I trust you. Don't let this company collapse." And I didn't. 30 years of working 14 hours a day. 30 years of trading everything away. Now I live in a 3-story house in the Garden District, the most prestigious historic neighborhood in New Orleans. French-style mansions stand beneath ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. My home has a wide wraparound porch, white columns, and ornate wrought iron fencing. My mother lives with me. We have Martha, the housekeeper who has been with our family for over 30 years. But beyond them, no one else. No husband, no children. No grandchildren, just me, my mother, and the cold distance every night when I came home. Everything began to fall apart on a Tuesday night last February. I drove my black BMW home at 11:40 p.m. A meeting with suppliers from Ghana had dragged late into the evening. A customs issue at the port required my presence. Then came hours of reviewing quarterly financial reports. My head was spinning with numbers, contracts, deadlines. I parked, walked inside. Dim light spilled from the kitchen. I knew immediately my mother was still awake. Rosalind Du Bois, 79 years old. A former literature teacher, warm-voiced, who once loved sitting on the porch reading every afternoon. But since my father's death, she had grown more anxious, more controlling, more rigid. She wanted me married, wanted grandchildren, wanted me to stop torturing myself with work. I stepped into the kitchen. My mother sat at the table, a cup of tea gone cold, eyes fixed on a health program on television. She didn't turn around. "You're coming home near midnight again," she said gently but tightly. "When will you finally rest?" I sighed. Took off my heels, grabbed a bottle of red wine, poured a glass, took a long gulp. My throat burned. "That's enough, Mama," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "I hear this every single day." She turned, stunned. "I worry about you." "Worry?" I gave a short laugh. "Mama, have you ever worried about the right things?" And then something broke inside me. 30 years of repression burst out uncontrollably. "Who do you think made me like this? Because of you. Because of Papa. Maribel. I loved Julian, truly loved him, but Mama said he was poor, unworthy. Papa said I shouldn't waste my youth." I talked about Marcus LeBlanc. About relationships crushed because they were too ambitious, not suitable. "I'm 55, Mama," I sobbed. "No husband, no children, just work and complaints." "You ruined your own life," my mother shouted. "What did you choose when Papa was in the hospital begging you? What did you choose when Mama cried every night, saying the family would lose everything?" Silence. I drained my glass, turned away. "I need sleep. I have meetings tomorrow." I heard my mother crying behind me, but I didn't turn back. I didn't apologize. I thought it would be like every argument before, but I was wrong. That was the last time my mother remembered who I was. The next morning, I woke at 7 with a splitting headache. I went downstairs, no mother. I left a note, "Coming home late, sorry about last night." Then I left. At 2 p.m., my phone rang. "Your mother is missing." My heart stopped. I raced home, searched everywhere. Her wallet was there. Her phone was there. Her car was still in the garage. I ran to the cemetery, knelt beside my father's grave. "Papa, what do I do?" There was no answer, only the wind moving through the branches of ancient oak trees. If you think this is the greatest pain of my life, then wait for the next part of the story, because the truth about where my mother went and why she ended up at that house by the lake is more devastating than anything I ever imagined. 3 days after my mother disappeared, I was sitting across from Detective Nolan Price in my own office. Darius LeGrand had introduced him. Darius said Price had once been a homicide detective and now worked as a private investigator specializing in missing person cases. He was 52 years old, with neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair and steel gray eyes, sharp as blades. Yet when he looked at me, there was something unexpectedly warm in them, as if he understood what it felt like to be on the verge of breaking apart from the inside. He opened his notebook and said calmly, "Ms. Dubois, tell me everything, from the beginning." So I told him. I told him about the argument in the kitchen, the words that had been compressed for 30 years, finally bursting out like a crack that could never be sealed again. I told him about waking up to an empty kitchen, and then Martha's phone call that struck like lightning. I told him how I had run around searching for my mother like a madwoman, from the house in the Garden District to neighbors, hospitals, and then the cemetery. At certain points, my throat tightened, my eyes burned, but I forced myself to speak clearly, because I knew that even the smallest detail might be the only thread still connecting me to my mother. Detective Price listened for a long time, then asked gently, as if afraid of hurting me further, "Do you think Mrs. Roslin may have left the house on her own? Out of anger?" I wiped my tears and shook my head immediately. My mother is 79 years old. She has heart disease. She would never go far without telling someone. And most importantly, she took nothing with her. No wallet. No phone, no heart medication. That isn't normal, he wrote carefully. Does she have any other relatives? Siblings? Close family? No siblings, I answered. She has close friends, Elizabeth Barnes and Valentina Ortiz. I've already called them. They don't know anything. Detective Price paused, then looked directly at me. I'll check nearby security cameras, interview neighbors, and review places Mrs. Roslin usually visits. Where did she go most often? I listed each place, as if reciting the last remaining fragments of her life still anchored in my memory. Lafayette Cemetery, where her husband is buried. St. Augustine Church. She goes there every Tuesday. Café du Monde. She loves café au lait and beignets. And, I hesitated for a second, then continued anyway, the house by Lake Pontchartrain, where our family used to spend summers together. He looked up. That lake house, is it still in use? It's vacant, I said softly. I rarely have time to go there. He nodded, then set his pen down as if weighing something heavy. Miss Dubois, I need you to prepare yourself. In my line of work, the early hours are the most critical. After 72 hours, the chances of finding a missing person drop significantly. My heart sank. It's already been more than 72 hours, I whispered, my voice falling into a void. I know, he said immediately, firmly, but I'll do everything I can. That first week, I lived like a walking corpse. Every morning when I opened my eyes, I told myself, today there will be news. Every night when I lay down, I felt a stone pressing on my chest. Another day has passed, and still nothing. Detective Price worked tirelessly. He reviewed security footage and eventually found a single clip, my mother leaving the house at 6 a.m., walking toward Magazine Street. That was all. After that, blank. Not another frame. As if my mother had dissolved into the air. He interviewed neighbors. No one had seen anything unusual. An elderly woman next door said firmly, Roslin is a good person, always polite, always greeting people. I saw her leave early that morning. I thought she was just out for her usual walk. He checked hospitals within a 100-mile radius. No patient named Roslyn Dubois. And I began doing something I had never imagined I would do. I printed flyers, hundreds of them. The bold letters felt like they were pounding straight into my heart. Missing, Roslyn Dubois. Age 79, height 5'5", brown skin. Silver hair tied neatly, brown eyes, wears reading glasses, last seen wearing a beige cardigan and black pants, has heart disease. Needs medication urgently. If seen, please call 504XXX. Darius and I posted them all over New Orleans, on lampposts, grocery store doors, bus stops, cafes, church bulletin boards, even on peeling old walls where job ads were usually taped. Every time I finished putting one up, I prayed silently, please, let someone see this. Please, let someone call, but the phone remained silent, and this was the strangest part. At times, I wasn't most afraid that my mother was dead. I was more afraid of something else, that she was still alive, somewhere out there, and people were simply walking past her, just imagining my mother huddled in some dark corner without a wallet, without a phone, without her heart medication, while no one noticed, no one stopped, was enough to drive me insane. I became obsessed with every park bench, every porch, every stairway in the city. New Orleans is crowded, loud, dazzling, but it is also a place where you can disappear without anyone noticing. And I stopped believing in daytime. I only believed in the hours when the city revealed its darker face. One night, I couldn't sleep. The clock read 2 a.m. I lay staring at the ceiling, and the thought stabbed into me like a knife. What if my mother is out there somewhere, cold and terrified? I jumped up, put on jeans, a hoodie, grabbed a flashlight, and drove out. New Orleans at night is a different world. Neon lights flickered on Bourbon Street. Jazz thundered from bars. The smells of alcohol, gumbo, and river dampness blended together. Drunk tourists staggered along. Homeless people curled up on the sidewalks. I walked slowly, sweeping my flashlight across every dark corner, studying every face. Every time I saw an elderly woman, my heart pounded, only to sink again. Not my mother. Never my mother. I stopped in front of a woman sitting beside a trash bin, a thin blanket over her shoulders. "Excuse me," I said softly, holding out my mother's photo. "Have you seen this woman?" She looked closely, then shook her head. "No, dear." "I'm sorry." I kept walking, kept asking. Jackson Square, Woldenberg Park, along the Mississippi River. Nothing. When dawn began to pale over the water, I collapsed onto the river steps, exhausted. Tears streamed endlessly. "Mom, where are you?" An elderly homeless man walked past. He stopped and looked at me, his voice hoarse. "Are you lost, miss?" "No." I wiped my face. "My mother is missing." He nodded as if he understood. "New Orleans is a city where people disappear easily," he said. "But sometimes they're found in the places you least expect." I didn't understand right away, but his words lodged in my mind like a hook. During those sleepless nights, memories of Julian Hayes returned like a curse. We met when I was 22 at an art exhibition in the Warehouse District. He was tall and slender, chestnut brown skin, deep black eyes. He stood in front of an oil painting of a wooden house by a river, his eyes lighting up like a child's. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I asked. "More than beautiful," he turned and smiled. "This is classic Creole architecture. Look at that wooden porch, the way the roof sheds rain, the ventilated columns. People back then understood how to live in harmony with the southern climate." We talked for 3 hours straight. He was a final-year architecture student at Tulane University, dreaming of designing homes that preserved New Orleans' heritage. He was poor, living on scholarships and part-time work at a bakery, but his passion burned brightly. We started dating, evenings strolling along the moon walk, hand in hand, jazz drifting in from afar. Mornings eating beignets at Café du Monde, powdered sugar dusting my lips while he laughed and gently wiped it away. Sunday afternoons with him sketching me by the window, sunlight falling through my hair. One night, on the balcony of his small apartment, Julian asked, "Will you marry me? When you graduate, find a job. We'll have a little house," he said. "We'll plant mimosa flowers like at my grandmother's place." I said yes, in pure happiness. Then I brought him home to meet my family. Dinner was tense as a drawn wire. My father was polite but cold. My mother asked questions, her gaze probing. When Julian left, I already knew what was coming. "Julian is a good boy," my father said gravely, "but my daughter, he has nothing. Just a poor student with vague dreams." "What are you saying, Dad?" I protested. "He's talented. He'll succeed." My mother took my hand, her voice soft but firm. "I know you love him, but love isn't enough to live on. You are the heir to Dubois Imports. You need a man worthy of standing beside you, not dragging behind. He's not dragging, I shouted. He's building his career. With what? My father asked. He has no money, no wealthy family backing him. You'd have to carry him. You deserve better. They kept talking. Every day, every night, and slowly, they planted a seed of doubt in me. If Julian really loved me, why isn't he moving faster? If he can't even support himself, how will he support a family? 3 months later, I met Julian in City Park, beneath a 100-year-old oak tree. The afternoon light was soft as silk. He smiled when he saw me, but that smile faded as he looked at my face. Mari, what's wrong? I couldn't look him in the eye. Julian, I think we should end this. Silence. So deep I could hear my own heart breaking. Why? His voice was small, like someone afraid of the answer. I need to focus on work. My family needs me. And you should focus on your career. We're in 2 different worlds. You don't believe in me anymore? That's exactly it. He stood up, eyes red. Your family convinced you, didn't they, that I'm not good enough? Julian, I'm sorry. Don't apologize. He turned away. If you truly loved me, you'd trust me, but you've made your choice. I wish you happiness, Maribel. He walked away. Didn't look back. I stood there, tears pouring down, knowing I had just made the greatest mistake of my life. 2 years later, I met Marcus LeBlanc. Marcus was the son of Henri LeBlanc, my father's greatest rival in the import business. The 2 families competed fiercely, but Marcus was nothing like his father. He was a corporate lawyer, intelligent, polished, and visionary. We met at a trade conference. He introduced himself first. Ms. Dubois, I've heard a lot about you. They say you're a business genius. Too kind, I replied with a polite smile. We talked business. He was sharp but not arrogant. He asked for my opinion on growth strategies. He laughed when I shared a humorous negotiation story. Then he invited me to dinner, then to a musical. Then to a moonlit boat ride on the Mississippi River. One night, under the silver moonlight, Marcus said, I don't care about the rivalry between our families. I only care about Maribel, the intelligent, strong, beautiful woman in front of me. My heart trembled. For the first time since Julian, I thought, maybe I still had the right to love. But my father found out. You're dating Marcus LeBlanc? My father roared in his office. Are you insane? Dad, he's not like Henri. They're LeBlancs. My father slammed his hand on the desk. They've always tried to destroy us. Marcus is getting close to you to spy, to sabotage the company. You're wrong. Marcus doesn't care about the company. You're naive, Maribel, my mother cut in. Men like Marcus are dangerous, charming, intelligent, but behind that is ambition. One day, when Henri LeBlanc grows old, Marcus will inherit everything. And if you're married to him, then he'll control both companies. We'll lose everything, I argued. But they wouldn't listen. They threatened, if you continue, we won't accept it. You must choose, Marcus or your family. And once again, I chose wrong. I called Marcus. I'm sorry. We can't continue. Because of your family? His voice was heavy. Because I can't hurt them. Mari, he sighed. You're hurting yourself. But my decision was made. I hung up, cried all night. 5 years later, I heard Marcus had married a lawyer in Baton Rouge. They had 2 children. He started his own firm and became wildly successful. And me? I had my work. Only my work. Detective Nolan Price did everything he could during the first 3 months. He combed every corner of New Orleans, interviewed hundreds of people, watched thousands of hours of footage. But at our 3rd month meeting, he looked at me, his voice heavy. Ms. Sen. Dubois, I'm very sorry. I've run out of leads. That's impossible. I shook my head desperately. People don't just vanish like that. He paused, then spoke softly. In a city like New Orleans, with swamps, waterways, sometimes... He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. My mother could be dead. Could have had an accident. Could have... I couldn't continue the thought. The police gradually closed the file. They called it a cold case. They promised to contact me if there was new information, but their voices sounded like a farewell. I kept living. But I wasn't really alive anymore. I went to work, attended meetings, signed papers, answered emails. But everything happened inside a thick fog, no color, no meaning. Every night I lay in the dark and replayed the last sentence I had hurled at my mother like a knife. Mama ruined my life. Now those words stab back at me every second. If only Mom could hear me say I'm sorry, I whispered. If only she knew how much I love her. But that chance never came. Or at least, that was what I believed then. In the 6th month since my mother went missing, Darius Legrand walked into my office with a face so serious that before I could even ask, my heart was already pounding faster. Ms. Dubois, the investors from Brussels have just sent an ultimatum. He set a stack of papers on my desk. They want an in-person meeting this week. Otherwise, they'll pull their funding. I looked up, but my eyes instinctively dropped to the photo of my mother sitting at the corner of my desk. The photo I had carried for 6 months, like a fragile talisman keeping me from collapsing. This week? I asked, my voice turning hoarse. Yes, Darius said. They want us to fly to Antwerp this afternoon, the 6 o'clock flight. I glanced at the clock, 2 p.m. It suddenly felt like I'd been thrown into a crossroads with no way back. Darius, I can't. I shook my head. If there's news about my mother, Ms. Dubois. His voice softened but remained firm as a locked door. Martha has your number. Detective Nolan Price does too. If there's any news at all, you'll know immediately. He paused, then continued slowly, so that each word seemed to sink deeper. But the company. 200 employees are counting on you. They have families. They have children to feed. If we lose this deal, I understood. I understood better than anyone. That deal was our lifeline. Without new capital, we would be forced to lay people off, cut back, maybe even shut down some branches. And I, the one who carried the Dubois name, would be the one signing decisions that could send hundreds of households crashing down. I clenched my hands. How long? I asked. 3 months, projected, Darius replied, but maybe it could be sooner. 3 months. 90 days away from home. 90 days of not being able to run all over New Orleans, searching for my mother myself. 90 days living with the fear of what if a lead appears, but I had no other choice. Fine, I exhaled, as if I were sentencing myself. Make the arrangements. We arrived at Louis Armstrong Airport at 5:15 p.m. I pulled my suitcase, my phone pressed tight to my ear, listening to Martha report on things at the house. And as it had been for 6 months, the answer was the same. Nothing new, no news, no trace. Martha, I repeated, my voice so frantic that even I could hear how pathetic I sounded. If there's anything, even the smallest thing, call me immediately, okay? Yes, Miss Maribel, Martha answered. Don't worry, I'll keep watch. I hung up. My heart felt heavy, as if someone had stuffed stones into it. A smoldering guilt gnawed at me every second. My mother is somewhere out there, and I'm leaving again. Darius had already gone ahead into the terminal. I paused for a few seconds to reply to an urgent email, and in those few seconds, everything shifted. I saw her. Right by the curb leading into the check-in entrance on the cold concrete edge, a young woman was holding a baby. She was around 30. Skin shining like honey, long braids falling over her shoulder. But what made me stop wasn't her beauty. It was her eyes exhausted into despair. The eyes of a mother who had hit rock bottom. The baby in her arms, no more than a year old, was wrapped in nothing but a thin blanket. New Orleans in February at night was still cold, around 10 degrees Celsius. The coat she wore was too large, clearly not hers. There was no luggage beside them. No handbag, only a small children's backpack. I should have kept walking. There were only 45 minutes left before check-in closed, but that image held me in place, as if someone had grabbed my feet. And a thought flashed, sharp as a knife. What if my mother is somewhere like this too? What if my mother needed help, but people simply swept past her as if she didn't exist? I turned and walked toward her. "Excuse me," my voice came out rough. "Are you okay?" The woman startled and looked up at me. Big brown eyes, beautiful like a painting, but full of fear. Instinctively, she tightened her hold on the baby as if I might snatch away the only thing she had left. Yes, I'm okay," she said quietly, avoiding my gaze. "We're fine." But her trembling voice betrayed everything. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone gentle so she wouldn't panic even more. She stayed silent for a long time. Then she slowly shook her head. Tears began to well up, something she'd been holding back for far too long. "No," she whispered. "We don't." The baby stirred and began to whimper. She hurried to rock him, her voice slipping into an old Louisiana lullaby. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." I looked at the baby. A boy around 10 months old, smooth brown skin, wide, round, dark eyes. His arms and legs were still baby plump, but he was visibly thinner, hungry. The boy was hungry. Inside my head, two currents of thought collided violently. Logic said, "Maribel, don't get involved. You don't know who she is. You're late. You have a flight. You have the deal." But my heart said, if someone had helped my mother like this, how much better would it be? And then I did something completely irrational. I'll tell the truth. In that moment, I wasn't some saintly person. I was an exhausted CEO, living on caffeine and responsibility. I'd spent 6 months chasing a silhouette with no answers. I had almost stopped believing in natural kindness. But the second I saw that woman holding her baby on cold concrete, I understood something brutal. Sometimes you help someone, not because you have an abundance of compassion, but because you can't bear the thought, what if that were my mother? Just imagining my mother sitting in some dark corner without heart medication, without a phone, with no one asking if she was okay, made it feel impossible to breathe. And because of that, in that moment, I chose to believe. I opened my handbag and pulled out my key ring, the keys to the lake house on Lake Pontchartrain, the one my father built when I was 10, the place where our family spent every summer, fishing, grilling shrimp, telling ghost stories under moonlight, the place my mother used to visit whenever she felt sad. I held the keys out. "Listen," I said quickly but clearly, "I have a house by Lake Pontchartrain near Slidell, about 40 miles from here. It's vacant. I'm about to fly out on a long business trip, maybe 3 months, maybe longer. Do you want to stay there?" The woman stared at me as if I'd just spoken an alien language. "What?" "My house," I repeated, holding the keys a little closer. "You and your baby can stay there. I don't need it during this time." She shook her head, so confused she was almost angry simply because she couldn't understand. "But why? You don't know me. You don't know who I am. Why would you—" "Because you have a baby who needs a roof," I said, as simply as I could. "And I have a roof sitting empty. That's all." "I can't take this," she said, but her eyes were locked on the keys. "This is too much." "You don't know me. I could be a bad person. I could—" "You're not a bad person," I cut in, my voice softening. "I can see it in your eyes. A mother trying to protect her child. There's nothing bad in that." The baby suddenly cried louder. She hurried to open the small backpack and pulled out a bottle, but it was empty. She shook it as if hoping for a few drops. There were none. Her tears fell, hot and heavy. "I'm sorry, my love," she whispered to the baby. "Mama will find you milk, I promise." And in that moment, I knew I had made my decision. "What's your name?" I asked. Tiana, she answered, her voice trembling. "Tiana Baptiste." "And this is Micah." "Maribel Dubois." I reached out and shook her hand lightly, not gripping hard because I could see her hands were shaking. "Tiana, I have to go right now, but I'll call my driver. He'll take you and Micah to the lake house, and he'll buy what you need: milk, diapers, clothes, food. Everything the two of you need." You don't have to do this," Tiana sobbed, choking on the words. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." I smiled, and it was my first smile in 6 months. "Just take good care of Micah. If you need anything at all, call me." I wrote my phone number on a slip of paper and handed it to her. "The house has everything. Clean sheets are in the bedroom closet. The kitchen has pots and pans. The heater runs on electricity. You'll figure out how to use it." Then I turned and called Cedric Banks, our private driver who had worked for my family for 15 years. "Cedric, are you still in the parking lot?" "Yes, Ms. Dubois, is there a problem?" "There's a woman and a baby at the terminal entrance." "Her name is Tiana. Take them to the lake house for me." "The lake house?" Cedric sounded startled. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said immediately. "And Cedric, on the way, stop at Big Easy Supermarket and buy baby formula, diapers, clothes for a baby boy around 1 year old, food, pasta, rice, vegetables, fruit, everything they need. I'll transfer the money to you." "Understood, ma'am." "I'm coming now." I turned back to Tiana. "Cedric will be here in a few minutes. He's kind. Don't worry, he'll take care of you both." Tiana held the key ring, her hands trembling violently. Tears streamed down her face. You saved us," she sobbed. "I don't know how to thank you. You're an angel. You saved our lives." "No." I shook my head, my voice catching. "I'm only doing what I hope someone would do for my mother if she's somewhere out there needing help." Tiana looked at me, not fully understanding, but I didn't have time to explain. "I have to go," I said quickly. "I wish you and Micah well." I turned away, pulled my suitcase, and ran into the terminal. But just before I disappeared inside, I heard Tiana calling after me as if throwing a prayer at my back. "Ms. Maribel, I'm praying you find your mother. I believe you will find her." I stopped, turned around, nodded once, like I was accepting that prayer. Then I ran. On the plane, Darius looked at me with an expression that was equal parts confusion and worry. "What did you just do?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "I saw you talking to a woman," he hesitated. "Did you give her something?" I nodded. "The lake house keys." Darius froze, as if he couldn't believe what he'd heard. "You gave a stranger the keys to your family's house." "She wasn't a stranger," I said softly. "She was a mother who needed help." "But Miss Dubois..." Darius dragged out the words, clearly trying to stay calm. "You don't know who she is. You don't know where she came from. What if she damages the house? What if she steals? What if..." "Darius," I cut him off, my voice not loud but firm enough to stop him. "I'm not afraid." "Where is that confidence coming from?" Darius asked, almost helpless. "From her eyes." I turned to the window. New Orleans grew smaller beneath us, like a fading streak of memory. There was no lie in them, only fear, despair, and a mother's love. "I know she won't harm anything." Darius exhaled. "I hope you're right." "I hope so too." The plane lifted off. I closed my eyes. I thought about Tiana and Micah. I thought about my mother. And I thought about the words Tiana had called after me. Simple, but as if they had reached straight into the softest part of me. "I believe you'll find her." "God, let it be true," I whispered into the air. "Please, let it be true." We landed in Brussels at 9 a.m. local time. From there, a car took us straight to Antwerp. the diamond port city of Belgium, in exactly 1 hour. The Hilton Old Town was luxurious. My room overlooked the groat-marked square, where historic Gothic facades stood shoulder to shoulder like a living painting. People said that if you stood there in the evening, Antwerp would be so beautiful it would take your breath away. But I had no mood to breathe. The moment I pulled the hotel door shut, I called New Orleans. "Martha, any news?" "Nothing, Ms. Maribel." Martha's voice sounded sorrowful, as if she, too, was tired of repeating that sentence far too many times. "I called Detective Price yesterday. He said there are still no new leads." I sank onto the edge of the bed. Guilt dropped onto me like a sledgehammer. "And Tiana and Micah?" I asked immediately, clinging to the only thing that still made me believe I wasn't completely terrible. "Did Cedric get them to the lake house?" "Yes," Martha replied. "Cedric called me last night. He said Miss Tiana is very kind. On the first night, she cleaned the house spotless." "Baby Micah is healthy. Cedric bought everything the two of them needed." "Good." I let out a long breath, so relieved I almost wanted to cry. "Martha, if there's any news about my mother, even in the middle of the night, call me immediately." "Yes, you can rest assured." I ended the call, lay back on the bed, and stared at the ceiling. The time difference was 7 hours. On this side of the ocean, it was daytime. In New Orleans, it was only 2 a.m. Where was my mother? Was she still alive? Was she thinking about her daughter? Tears spilled out, hot and helpless, but I had no right to sink into them. 3 hours later was my first meeting. The conference room in the Van Bylant building was icy cold. 5 investors from Belgium and the Netherlands sat across from me, their faces stern. They didn't smile. There was none of the pleasant small talk Americans usually offered, only cold eyes scanning me from hair to shoes, as if I were a number. "Mademoiselle Dubois," said Peter Van Doren, the head of the investor group. His French, mixed with a hint of Flemish, sounded dry and sharp. "We have reviewed your company file. Revenue growth was good last year, but your debt ratio is high. How do you ensure we won't lose money?" I stood and brought my presentation up on the large screen. "Look here," I said, pointing directly at the chart. "Our revenue has grown steadily by 18% every year over the past 5 years. Our debt is high because we invested in expanding warehouses at the ports of Mobile and Savannah. Those are fixed assets, not bad debt." I paused, then moved into the most important part. "With your capital, we will expand into the European market, especially France, Germany, and the UK. I already have preliminary agreements with 2 retail chains in Paris and London." I spoke for an hour. Darius sat beside me, supporting with figures, answering detailed questions. But they weren't easy. "Exchange rate risk?" they asked. "We'll purchase hedging insurance," I answered immediately. "Political risk in the African countries where you source products?" "We diversify supply across 6 different countries." "Projected return?" 3 years with a 22% profit." They kept questioning. I kept answering. The meeting ran until 7 p.m. When it ended, I was exhausted, as if I'd run a marathon with no finish line. And worse, they still hadn't decided. "We need more time to consider," Van Doren said coldly. "See you next week." Every evening, I called New Orleans. Not only Martha, but Cedric Banks as well, because Cedric was the only person truly seeing what was happening at the lake house on Lake Pontchartrain. One night, at the end of the first weekend, I asked, "Cedric, how are they?" "Ms. Maribel, Ms. Tiana is wonderful," Cedric said, his voice carrying a rare hint of excitement. "She keeps the house spotless, even planted flowers in the garden, and she cooks very well. She even found a job at a grocery store in Slidell." "A job?" I froze. "That fast?" "Yes," Cedric replied. "The owner, Mr. Pete Robichaux, is a good man. He gave her a part-time position and even allows her to bring Micah along. The pay isn't much, but Miss Tiana wants to be independent. She said she doesn't want to rely completely on your kindness." My nose stung. Tiana is a good person, I said softly. She is, ma'am. Cedric hesitated. And there's something else. My heart suddenly clenched. What? I asked quickly. Cedric fell silent for a second, as if weighing whether he should say it. Yesterday, when I came by, I saw Ms. Tiana talking with an elderly woman. I stopped breathing. An elderly woman? My voice trembled. Yes. An older black woman, gray hair, wearing a beige cardigan, Cedric said slowly. Tiana said she was lost, wandering near the Lake Pontchartrain Bridge. She brought her back to the lake house, fed her, let her rest. My world went still. What did she look like? I asked, my voice thin as a thread. Around 70 or 80. About 1.65 meters tall. At first she was very confused, couldn't remember how to get home. But when she stepped into the lake house, she said something that made my blood run cold. Cedric lowered his voice. She said, "I know this place. I've been here with Langston." I let the phone slip from my hand. My fingers shook so badly I couldn't pick it up right away. "Ms. DuBois," Cedric called urgently from the other end. "Are you still there?" I drew a deep breath, grabbed the phone again, my voice breaking apart. "Langston is my father's name. What did you say?" I almost screamed, crying as I spoke, as if pouring 6 months into a single sentence. "Cedric, that elderly woman is my mother." "That's Rosalind DuBois. My mother is at the lake house." There are moments in life that don't arrive like a door opening. They arrive like a blow straight into your chest. For 6 months, I had prayed, screamed in silence, imagined every possible ending. I thought my mother was lying somewhere in an anonymous hospital or in some corner of the city I hadn't searched yet. Or worse. But I had never imagined this. My mother wasn't far away. My mother was in the exact place I had handed over to a stranger with my own hands, as if fate had quietly arranged everything and had only been waiting until I heard enough to see it. I called Tiana Baptiste immediately, the number I had given her that day at the airport. She picked up after 3 rings. "Hello?" Tiana's voice sounded tired. Somewhere in the background I heard Micah crying. "Tiana, this is Maribel DuBois." "Miss Maribel," Tiana cried out. "I was going to call you, but I haven't had the chance." "Cedric just told me about the elderly woman," I said quickly, afraid that if I slowed down for even a second, everything would vanish. "The woman you helped yesterday, is she still there?" "Yes," Tiana answered at once. "She's here. She's asleep now. But Miss Maribel, she's very strange. She doesn't remember who she is, she doesn't remember her address, but she keeps repeating the name Langston and saying, 'We came here every summer.'" "Tiana." My voice shook so hard I had to grip the edge of the bed so I wouldn't fall. "Listen to me. That elderly woman is my mother, Rosalind DuBois. She disappeared 6 months ago. I've searched everywhere for her." "Oh my God," Tiana gasped. "Your mother? I didn't know. I had no idea. Please," I cried, "take care of my mother. Don't let her go anywhere again. I'm coming back right away." "But you're in Europe. I'll find a way." I swallowed my tears. "Tiana, promise me. Promise me you'll keep my mother safe." "I promise," Tiana said firmly. "I'll take care of her like she's my own mother. Don't worry." I hung up, and then I collapsed onto the hotel floor, sobbing like a child. 6 months. 6 months of desperate searching, and my mother had been right there. In the place where I'd handed keys to a stranger, Darius heard the noise and the crying. He flung the door open and rushed in. "Ms. DuBois! What happened?" "Found her," I choked out between sobs. "Darius, I found my mother. She's at the lake house. All this time, she's been there." Darius went still. "Really?" He dropped to his knees, gripping my shoulders. "That's incredible. You have to go home immediately." "But the negotiations," I gasped. "The company needs me. 200 employees, Forget the negotiations, Darius said decisively. This is your mother. Nothing is more important. I'll handle the rest. I shook my head, tears still pouring. No. If I leave, they'll pull the funding. Darius stared straight into my eyes, an expression I had rarely seen from him in 10 years. Not an assistant's look, but the look of a man trying to pull me out of the hole I had buried myself in. Ms. Du Bois, he said slowly, I've worked with you for 10 years. I've seen you sacrifice everything for this company. Don't sacrifice again this time. Go home. See your mother. I'll stay and handle it. My tears fell harder. But this time, something warm rose inside me. Gratitude. I intended to book a ticket back to the U.S. that very night, but the next morning, Van Doren called. Mademoiselle Du Bois, we need an emergency meeting. His voice was still cold. One of our partners in Paris wants to join the deal. They require you to fly to Paris today and present. If they agree, the funding will double. But I need to go back to the U.S. urgently, I tried. If you don't come, we cancel the entire agreement. I stood at a crossroads. On one side was my mother, the woman I had searched for 6 months, now at the lake house, not remembering who I was. On the other side was the company, the thing I had devoted my entire life to, with 200 employees and their families. In the end, I made a decision that even now still hurts like biting into bone. Give me 3 months, I said. I will finish the negotiations, but after that, no matter what happens, I will go home. 3 months turned into 4, 4 turned into 5. They were cunning. They knew I needed them, so they dragged it out. More conditions, more demands, more meetings. I flew from Antwerp to Paris, from Paris to Amsterdam. From Amsterdam to Frankfurt. Each city was a new round of negotiations, and each round was another rope binding me. But every night, I called the lake house. Tiana told me about my mother, Mrs. Rosalind doesn't clearly remember the recent past, but she remembers when she was young. She talks about her husband, Mr. Langston, talks about picnics by the lake, talks about teaching. But about you, about the recent years, she doesn't remember anything. Has a doctor examined her yet? I asked, my voice thick. Yes, Tiana replied. I took her to Slidell Medical Center. The doctor said she had a mild stroke, TIA. It affected the brain area responsible for long-term memory. She can recover, but it will take time and care. Tiana, I said through tears, thank you. You saved my mother not just once, but twice. You saved me and Micah first, Tiana said gently. This is how I repay you. Through the phone, I heard Micah's bright giggle. And then, I heard an older woman's voice begin to hum a lullaby. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. I went completely still. That voice, my mother's voice, my heart melted like wax. In the 6th month, we finally signed the contract. The investors committed $8.5 million to the company, enough to expand into Europe, hire more staff, and upgrade our warehouses. Van Doren shook my hand. Mademoiselle Du Bois, you are an excellent negotiator. Congratulations. Thank you, I replied. But my mind had been flying back to New Orleans for a long time. That very night, I booked a flight back to the U.S., the earliest one, 6 a.m. the next morning. On the plane, I couldn't sleep at all. 6 months. 6 months away from my mother. 6 months with my mother not remembering who I was. Will she remember again? I wondered, my heart twisting tight. Will she forgive the things I said? I didn't know, but I knew one thing as surely as breath. I would spend the rest of my life making it right. The moment the plane's wheels touched down at Louis Armstrong Airport at 2 p.m., I sprang to my feet like a coil. I didn't wait for the baggage carousel. I didn't wait for my checked suitcase. I just gripped my carry-on backpack tightly and nearly ran out to the parking lot. Cedric Banks was already waiting, his tall, familiar frame leaning against the car door. Ms. Du Bois! Cedric opened the door, his voice warm. Welcome home. Cedric. Straight to Lake Pontchartrain, I said the second I sat down, my breath still quick. As fast as you can. Yes, ma'am. The car pulled out. The familiar road stretched ahead. I looked out the window, and for the first time in months, New Orleans in my eyes was no longer just a city. It was hope. The old Creole houses, the oak trees draped with Spanish moss, the corner cafe I'd passed 1,000 times, yet had never seen it look so alive. Cedric, I swallowed. My mother. How is she? Cedric smiled in the rearview mirror, as if he'd been waiting for me to ask that question for a long time. Mrs. Roslin is doing well, ma'am. She really likes the lake house. Every morning she wakes up early, walks around the lake, feeds the ducks. She talks with Ms. Tiana about her youth, about Mr. Langston. She looks very peaceful, ma'am. My heart warmed for a second, then tightened immediately. Has she asked about me? I asked softly, as if I was afraid to hear the answer out loud. Cedric paused. Then he shook his head gently. She doesn't remember you, Miss Maribel, he said slowly, as if apologizing. I'm sorry. I nodded, forcing the tears back down my throat. I know, my voice caught. I was hoping. 40 minutes later, the car turned onto the familiar dirt road leading to the lake house. Pine trees lined both sides, the scent of damp soil and wild grass. Then the 2-story wooden house appeared, the house my father had built with his own hands when I was little, the place that held the happiest memories I had ever thought I'd lost. But it was different. The front garden was bursting with color. Louisiana lilies, carnations, petunias. The fence had been freshly painted. The windows shone clean. Warm yellow light spilled from inside. This house was no longer forgotten. It was being lived in, being cared for, being loved. I stepped out of the car, my legs shaking so badly I had to stand still for a few seconds just to keep my balance. My heart was pounding like a drum. Where is she? I whispered. Behind the house, ma'am, Cedric pointed. By the lake. I walked. One step at a time, slow, heavy, like moving through water. I was afraid that if I moved too fast, this moment would burst like a soap bubble. I rounded to the back of the house. Golden afternoon sunlight spread across the surface of Lake Pontchartrain. A light breeze blew through, carrying the smell of water and fresh grass. And then I saw them. In the old wooden rocking chair, the chair my father made years ago, an elderly woman was sitting. Gray hair neatly pinned up, a beige cardigan, so familiar it hurt. On her lap was a baby about 1.5 years old, giggling brightly. Look, Micah, her voice rang out, warm as honey. The ducks are flying. 1, 2, 3. Micah clapped and squealed. Duck, duck! She laughed, pulling him close. That's right, you're so smart. I stood frozen. I didn't dare take another step. I was afraid that if I called out, my mother would turn, look at me with emptiness, and I would collapse on the spot. But then, as if she sensed my breath, my mother turned her head. Those familiar brown eyes looked straight at me. Her eyes were bright. Her face was radiant, but inside them, there wasn't a single spark of recognition. Hello? My mother said politely, her voice gentle. Are you Tiana's guest? In that instant, it felt like all the air had been pulled from my lungs. The world shattered. Mama, I blurted, my voice breaking. My mother tilted her head, curious, like someone meeting an acquaintance, but unable to remember where. What did you call me? Mama, I repeated it, stepping closer, tears streaming without stopping. Mama, it's me. I'm Maribel. I'm your daughter. My mother studied me intently. Her brows drew together, as if she were trying to drag a thread of memory up from some deep bottom. But then, she shook her head and smiled apologetically. I'm sorry, sweetheart, my mother said softly. I don't remember. I don't know you. I dropped to my knees in front of her like a child. I took my mother's hand, small, wrinkled, but still warm. "Mama, I'm Maribel, your daughter, yours and Papa Langston's," I said, as if whispering into my own heart. "We live in New Orleans." "You taught literature at the high school. Papa ran the import company, and I've lost you for 6 months." My mother listened, eyes widening. "Langston," she whispered. "I remember Langston." "My husband, we loved each other. We had this house." "Yes, Mama." I nodded over and over as if I were afraid the story would slip out of my hands. "Papa built this house. Every summer we came here. Papa taught me how to fish. You cooked gumbo and jambalaya. At night we sat by the campfire telling ghost stories. Do you remember?" My mother smiled dreamily. "I remember," she said slowly. "The smell of gumbo, the laughter, and a house full of sunlight." Then she lifted her hand and wiped the tears from my cheek, the motion gentle, as natural as a mother who had done it her whole life. "But sweetheart," my mother looked at me, her voice very soft. "I don't remember your face. I'm sorry." I clutched my mother's hand and sobbed. "It's okay, Mama," I said through my sobs. "I understand. I only need you alive. I only need you here with me." There is a kind of pain that isn't loud. It isn't a blow that knocks you down right away. It's the moment you finally touch what you've been searching for half a year, yet when you reach out, it slips through you like sand. I found my mother, but my mother didn't find me, and I understood. This reunion wasn't a beautiful ending. It was a beginning of a different fight, the fight to piece together broken fragments of memory and to piece my own heart back together, little by little. Just then, Tiana Baptiste stepped out from the house, a dish towel still in her hand. When she saw me, she stopped, her eyes already red-rimmed. "Miss Maribel!" I stood and hugged Tiana, hugged her tight as if holding a miracle. "Thank you," I said, my voice going unsteady. "Thank you for saving my mother. Thank you for taking care of her," Tiana cried. "I only did the right thing," she said, her voice trembling. "The way you did for me." We sat down by the lake. Micah ran over and wrapped his arms around my legs. "Auntie!" I bent down and hugged him, laughing through tears. "Hey, beautiful baby," I said, pulling him close. Micah had grown, cheeks round and plump, eyes bright. "Micah is very attached to Mrs. Roslin," Tiana said softly. "She's like his grandmother." I turned to Tiana. "Tiana, can you tell me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "How did you find my mother?" Tiana nodded. "It was 4 days after you let us stay here," she began. I took Micah for a walk by the lake, near the Lake Pontchartrain Bridge. The weather was nice, and I wanted my son to see the view. Then I saw an elderly woman standing in the middle of the road, very confused, looking around like she was lost. "My mother alone?" I asked, my throat tightening. "Yes, no one with her," Tiana replied. She was wearing a beige cardigan and black pants, just like today, but her clothes were dirty, her hair was a mess. She looked like she'd been wandering for days. I closed my eyes, imagining my mother, a 79-year-old woman, lost, with no medication, no phone, not knowing who she was, and my heart felt torn open. I walked up and asked, "Do you need help?" Tiana continued. She looked at me, eyes full of fear, but also full of pleading. She said, "I'm looking for my home, the house by the lake. Langston is there." "And you brought her back here?" "Yes," Tiana nodded. At first she hesitated, but when she saw this house, her eyes lit up. She stepped inside, looked around, and then she cried. She said, "This is my home with Langston. We were so happy here." I swallowed a sob. "Did she remember me?" Tiana shook her head. "She remembers Mr. Langston very clearly. She remembers her youth. But the recent years, it's like they were erased." She paused. I took her to the doctor. The doctor said she had a mild stroke, TIA. It may have happened around the time she left the house. It affected the memory areas of her brain. Can she recover? I asked, clinging to a thread. The doctor says it's possible, Tiana replied. It takes time, medication, and family to care for her. The most important thing is a familiar environment. Old photos, retelling memories. The brain can reconnect. I looked toward my mother. She was playing with Micah, teaching him to count fingers, smiling gently as if the past 6 months had never happened. She looks happy, I said quietly. She's very happy here, Tiana answered. She loves this house, loves the lake, and she loves Micah like her own grandchild. I turned back to Tiana. And you, I asked slowly, you haven't told me. Why were you at the airport that day? What happened? Tiana fell silent. Her eyes drifted out across the lake. Then she exhaled, as if letting out an entire chapter of her life. I got married when I was 25, she began, to a man named Marcus Devereaux. He was wealthy, owned a chain of beauty salons in New Orleans. He was charming, polite, he knew how to say sweet things, and I fell in love with him. Then what? I asked, gripping her hand. Then Micah was born, and everything changed. Tiana's voice began to shake. Marcus started getting jealous of his own son. He said I spent too much time on Micah and neglected him. Then he started yelling, and then hitting. I squeezed her hand tighter. I'm so sorry, I said, my voice rough. The first time he slapped me because dinner was 5 minutes late, Tiana continued, tears falling. The second time he shoved me. He controlled everything, money, my phone, my friends. I was a prisoner in my own home. Why didn't you call the police? I asked, my heart tightening. I was afraid, Tiana admitted. Afraid he'd take custody. He had money, he had good lawyers, and I was just an unemployed accountant. Who would believe me? And then you decided to run? Yes. Tiana nodded. I secretly saved every dollar. Change left over from buying vegetables, the grocery money he gave me. It took me 6 months just to have enough for a bus ticket. One afternoon, Marcus went to work. I grabbed Micah and ran. I only brought enough clothes to wear and a little formula. I didn't dare bring my phone because he could track it. She drew a long breath. I got on the first bus, didn't know where I was going, only that I had to leave New Orleans. And then you ended up at the airport? The last bus stopped at the airport, Tiana said, her voice breaking. I ran out of money. Micah was hungry. I sat there not knowing what to do anymore. And then you appeared. You were like an angel, Miss Maribel, Tiana sobbed. You saved our lives. You gave us a home, hope, a future. She looked at me, her voice trembling but firm. And now I can repay you by taking care of your mother. I hugged Tiana tightly. No, I said. We saved each other. That afternoon, when Micah fell asleep, the three of us sat at the old wooden table on the porch. My mother sipped herbal tea, eyes fixed on the blazing red sunset spilling onto the lake. I like it here, my mother said simply. Peaceful. Langston would like it. Mama, I said gently, I want to bring you back to New Orleans, back to our home. My mother looked at me, confused. Back to New Orleans? Yes, I nodded. The house in the Garden District. You lived there for 30 years. Your room is there, the flower garden you planted, the piano you played. But I don't remember that house, my mother said honestly, her eyes briefly sad. I know. I kept my voice soft. But maybe when you go back, you'll remember. The doctor said a familiar environment can help the brain recover. My mother fell silent for a moment, then turned and took Tiana's hand. And what about Tiana and Micah? My mother asked. Where will they live? That question stabbed my heart because it proved something. My mother didn't remember me, but she still knew how to care. We'll go back together, I said immediately. Tiana, I want you to work at my company. You were an accountant, right? I need someone like you. And Micah, we'll find a good preschool. We'll all live in the big house. Tiana's mouth fell open. You mean it? I do. I nodded. You saved my mother, Tiana. This is how I thank you. And more than that, we need each other. My mother needs you and Micah. You need a safe place and a job, and I hesitated for a beat, then said the thing I feared admitting most. I need a family. My mother smiled as if she'd just heard exactly what she needed. That sounds good, she said gently. Family. I turned to my mother. So, Mama, do you agree? My mother looked at Tiana, then at Micah, then at me, like she was weighing something very deep. Then my mother nodded. Okay, she said. If Tiana and Micah come too, I agree. We held each other beneath the Lake Pontchartrain sunset. 3 women and a baby, a new family, not by blood, but by love. A week later, we moved back into the house in the Garden District. Martha was already waiting at the gate, clutching her apron tightly, as if she might burst into loud sobs. The moment she saw Mrs. Rosalind Du Bois step out of the car, Martha broke down, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Rosalind, thank God. You're back. My mother looked at Martha, her eyes confused, as if she were trying to match a name to a familiar face she couldn't quite reach. You are? That's Martha, Mama, I said gently, forcing my voice to stay calm. Martha has worked for our family for 30 years. 30 years, my mother repeated, as if testing that number against her memory. But then she only smiled, apologizing with that familiar, gentle warmth. I'm sorry. I don't really remember. It's all right, ma'am. Martha took my mother's hand, her own trembling with joy. As long as you're home, that's all that matters. I led my mother inside. With every step she took on the polished wooden floor, I silently watched her face, because I felt that if even a single flicker of recognition appeared, it would be enough to bring me back to life. The living room with its classic deep blue velvet sofa, the Steinway piano, the one my mother used to play every night. The library filled with literature, the flower garden behind the house with a row of white lilies my mother had planted with her own hands. This is Mama's home, I said, my voice so soft it was almost as if I were speaking to myself. Mama has lived here since she married Papa. My mother walked slowly, reaching out to touch each object as if she were reading a book with no words. Then she stopped in front of the piano. Her fingers tapped lightly on the keys. A clear note rang out, echoing through the house like a distant call. I know how to play, my mother said, genuinely surprised. I remember Chopin, Nocturne. I nearly stopped breathing. That's right, I blurted out, unable to hold it back. Mama is amazing at piano. Mama used to play Chopin every night. My mother sat down. Both hands settled on the keys, and then she began to play. The melody of Nocturne Op. 9, number 2, flowed out, smooth, deep, tender as water. My mother's fingers remembered what her mind had just dropped. I stood perfectly still, tears spilling over. This was my mother, not my memory of her. My mother, here, now, returning, little by little. Tiana, Baptiste, and Micah moved into the suite on the second floor. I hired a tutor and a physical therapist to come to the house and help my mother recover. Every day, we looked through old photo albums together, retelling stories as if we were stitching a life back together with soft thread. This is Mama and Papa's wedding, I said, pointing at a photo, in 1968. Mama wore a white lace dress. You were beautiful. My mother stared intently. Langston was so handsome, she said with a quiet laugh, her eyes lighting up. I remember that day. It was so hot. I was sweating in that dress, but I was happy. I turned the page. And this is me when I was 3. Mama was holding me at Audubon Park. My mother looked at the picture for a long time, then shook her head, her voice gentle but sharp like a needle. A cute baby, but I don't remember. I squeezed her hand. It's okay, Mama. We have time. And just as the doctor said, little fragments of memory began to find their way back on their own. One morning, my mother stood by the kitchen smelling the coffee brewing and said, I like chicory coffee with a little milk. That's right, Martha beamed. You've drunk it that way your whole life. Another afternoon, my mother went into the garden and stopped in front of a rose bush, her hand brushing a petal. I planted this, she said slowly. Eden roses. Langston gave them to me in... What year was it? In 1985, Mama, I answered immediately. Your 20th wedding anniversary. My mother smiled like a child who had just remembered something precious. That's right, 20 years. Meanwhile, Tiana started working at the company. Darius Legrand introduced her to the system. And I had to admit, I was surprised by how quickly she learned. Not the kind of fast that comes from rushing, but the kind that comes from real ability. After the first week, Darius reported to me, Ms. Baptiste is truly talented. She found 3 accounting errors we've missed for the past 2 years. I went to find Tiana in her office. You did an excellent job. Tiana smiled, but her eyes were different now, more confident, more grounded, like someone who had found solid ground under her feet again. I'm just doing my work, she said. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I feel like I'm alive again. You deserve it, I said honestly. How's Micah? He's so happy, Tiana laughed. He loves preschool. And he loves Mrs. Roslin. Every night she reads to him. That was true. Every night my mother sat beside Micah's bed and read fairy tales. Her voice was melodic, warm. Micah listened, entranced, eyes shining as if he could see an entire world. One night, Micah looked up and asked, Grandma, do you have grandchildren? My mother paused. She looked toward the doorway where I was standing. Her eyes rested on me for a second, not empty like before, but as if an invisible thread tugged gently. Yes, my mother said. I have a daughter. She's here. Micah tilted his head. Aunt Maribel? My mother nodded. That's right. Maribel is my daughter. Micah squealed as if he'd discovered something important. Then am I your grandchild? My mother smiled and kissed Micah's forehead. You are my grandchild, she said, her voice soft as a warm blanket. And I love you so much. There was something strange I realized during those months. My mother's memory didn't return in an all-at-once way. It returned like raindrops. At first, only a drop, the smell of chicory coffee. Then another, a Chopin piece. Then another, the Eden roses. And with every drop that fell, I felt both hope and fear. Because I knew the moment my mother remembered everything would also be the moment she remembered the night we fought. She would remember what I said. She would remember how her daughter hurt her. And I didn't know if I had the courage to face that moment. 3 months passed. Autumn turned into winter. Christmas drew near. I decorated the house with twinkling lights, a Christmas tree, and wreaths. Martha cooked gumbo and traditional king cake. Tiana helped me wrap gifts. Micah ran around the house, excitedly talking about Santa Claus, and my mother sat by the window, looking out at the garden, where a rare dusting of snow lay thin over the grass. Then she called softly, Maribel. I turned. Yes, Mama? Come here. I sat down beside her. She held my hand and looked straight into my eyes for a long time, so long I could hear my own heartbeat. Then my mother spoke, her voice trembling as if she had just stepped out of a long dream. I remember. I stopped breathing. I remember you. My whole body went numb. Mama, you really remember me? My mother nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I remember the day you were born, she said. I held you in the hospital room. You were so tiny, your skin all pink. Langston cried from happiness. My tears poured out before I could wipe them away. I remember the first day I took you to school, my mother continued. You cried, holding my hand tight, refusing to go into the classroom. She squeezed my hand as if she needed to be sure I was truly here. I remember the day you graduated college. Her voice broke. You wore a black gown, holding your diploma, smiling so brightly. I couldn't hold it anymore. I sobbed like a child. And then, my mother continued, the thing I had been both afraid of and waiting for. I also remember the night we fought. I held my breath. You said your father and I ruined your life, my mother said slowly. You said I stole your happiness. I lowered my head as if receiving a sentence. I was so angry, my mother said, her voice choking. The next morning, I went outside wanting to walk it off. But then I didn't know where I was. I got lost. I couldn't remember the way home. Mama. I wrapped my arms around her, my voice breaking apart. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. I love you, Mama. I have always loved you. My mother stroked my hair, her hand trembling but gentle. I know, sweetheart, she said, and I'm sorry too. I lifted my face, not believing what I'd heard. Your father and we were too strict, she continued, tears falling. I wanted what was best for you, but I hurt you. I'm sorry I stole your youth. No, Mama. I shook my head, crying and smiling at the same time. That was my decision too. I chose work over love. I held my mother's hand tightly. But now I understand, I said. Family is what matters most. We held each other. We cried. Then we laughed, as if years of pain had finally found a place to land. That Christmas was the happiest Christmas of my life. All of us gathered around the dining table. My mother sat at the head, Tiana to her left, me to her right. Micah in his high chair. Martha served food with a radiant smile. Darius was invited too, not just as an assistant anymore, but like family. Let's pray before we eat, my mother said. We held hands. My mother prayed, Lord, thank you for bringing us back to each other. Thank you for this family, not by blood, but by love. Thank you for the painful lessons that taught us to treasure one another more. Please bless us. Amen. Amen, we said together. Dinner was warm and intimate, laughter filling the house, and I realized what I had been searching for over my 55 years wasn't success. It wasn't money. It was love. It was family. It was the simple moments beside the people you cherish. And now, looking back on my story, I want to say to you, the one listening, if you're living in regret, remember, it's never too late to heal. If you're trading family for work, stop for a moment and ask yourself, where are you running to? If you're in a violent relationship, be brave enough to step away. Someone will help you, like I helped Tiana. And if you've lost a loved one, don't give up. Fate sometimes works in miraculous ways we can't understand. One small decision, handing a house key to a stranger at an airport, changed my entire life. It brought my mother back. It gave me a new family. It taught me that kindness is never wasted. Today, the company is still growing, but I no longer work until midnight. I come home to dinner with my family. I spend Saturdays playing with Micah. I sit with my mother every night, listening to her tell stories from the past. And I am happy, truly happy, because I learned one simple thing. Life isn't measured by success, but by the love we give and the love we receive.